Make sure to like, follow, and subscribe to our podcast.
Listen, do what you gotta do to keep us around, okay?
The views and opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily represent those of Weaver Simmons. The contents of this podcast are strictly for informational purposes and not to be construed in any way as legal advice. If you have an issue that you believe requires legal advice, we suggest you contact a lawyer, and if you do not have the financial means to do so, contact Legal Aid Ontario or the Law Society of Ontario. The links are provided in the description below.
Welcome to episode 2 of Off the Cuff. I'm Darren Chohan.
And I'm Matt Butler. We'd first like to thank everybody who took the time to check out the first podcast, whether it be on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. We're having a lot of fun doing these podcasts, and hopefully you like the first one. As you can see, we have a cool new set here. We got cool new mics, and we're really digging this new setup.
Yeah, it's been really fun. I've had a lot of fun doing this. I didn't think that I would enjoy it as much as I do.
It's pretty great.
It is really good, and I really enjoy being able to just come here and chat about whatever we're talking about that day. And I think
talk off the cuff.
Yes. Yeah, makes sense, right? And so it's really one of those things where it's really grown on me. Yeah. With all these new improvements, it means that we're getting better, and it's going to be better, and we hope that it gets better. And so, as Matt said, that we're also always looking for suggestions for new topics. Drop us a line, let us know, because I think whatever's on your mind is what we want to talk about, right?
Absolutely.
Which leads us to today. Today is a bit of an interesting topic, hey?
Yeah, it's a good one. It's one that's not fun, but we've all dealt with.
Sometimes we've all dealt with it. It's probably hit close to home for some people, and
yeah.
COVID-19.
Yeah, and
it seems like it's all we talk about now.
It's dominated everybody's lives for the better part of 2 years now.
Yeah, we're almost there, 2 years?
Yeah, in March it's going to be 2 years.
It's rough.
It's been tough.
But if there's a positive or a silver lining, maybe, it's that with all the bad that COVID's thrown at us, I think that there have been some positives.
Such as?
Well, I think that, workplaces have changed.
Right.
Efficiencies have changed.
Sure.
Our supply chain sucks.
Yeah.
But employees are learning on, new ways to work.
Sure.
Employers are learning new ways to motivate their employees. And I think in a time where we're so focused on mental health and mental well-being, this pandemic has opened up different avenues to make your workplace mental health and well-being better. More options to work from home.
Right.
More options for parents to flex time to be with their kids more. Mm-hmm. I think for those of us who don't have a 2-hour commute to go back and forth to work every day, they're probably appreciating the work from home a little bit more.
Likely, yes.
So I think all those factors have been, from what I see, positives. I think in our profession specifically, I know you're loving virtual court.
I love it.
I hate it, but that's where we differ.
That's okay. We're not the same person.
No, that's okay. We have to disagree sometimes, I guess, right?
Yeah.
Otherwise, this wouldn't be fun.
Nope.
Yeah. So today, our topic, we focus on COVID-19 and vaccinations.
Vaccinations in the workplace specifically. We have a great guest who's given many presentations about COVID-19 vaccines and the policies that go along with that. And
it's really cool because not only is he a great guest, but we're lucky enough to be able to work with him.
Yeah, it's pretty great because not only is he very knowledgeable on this topic, but we get the firsthand knowledge of his presentations, and frankly, they are very informative because it's such a hot topic. It's like you said, it's the topic that everybody's been affected by, everybody's been talking about for the last 2 years. So to have someone who not only knows of the law of these policies and the vaccine mandates, but to have him sort of expand on it and explain it today, I think it's going to be very informative and just great to have.
Yeah, and I think it's really relevant because, of course, that's all we talk about, but everyone is either an employee or an employer, generally speaking, and it's information that you need to know. But sometimes you don't have access to a lawyer to ask those questions, especially if you're a small business owner.
Exactly.
Right? And so you don't necessarily want to spend a fortune trying to figure out a policy,
100%.
but you might need to know what he has to say because he's not able to maybe develop that policy for you, and if you're not going to reach out, but at least what he has to say will help guide your decisions on how to move forward, right?
I think so. Yeah.
And with that, I think, why are we talking about it? We should just get him in here, right?
Let's take an ad break and then let's get Zach in here.
I think that makes sense.
Perfect.
Great.
This episode of Off the Cuff is brought to you by Weaver Simmons LLP, Northern Ontario's largest full-service law firm with over 30 lawyers and 60 support staff. For over 90 years, the law firm of Weaver Simmons has proudly served the interests of Northern Ontario residents and has built its reputation based on exceptional services to its clients. For more information about the firm, please visit www.weaversimmons.com. The link is provided in the description below.
Welcome back. We're joined here with a very special guest, Zachary Courtemanche, who is a lawyer who practices in labor and employment. Zach, why don't you tell us a bit about yourself and your practice?
Sure. Well, thanks, Matt, and thanks for the invite tonight. As you said, I'm a lawyer. I'm a partner at Weaver Simmons. I practice in labor and employment law, representing employers. So what that means is I help companies and organizations deal with their employees and their unions. Sometimes that means things like hiring and employment contracts through to wrongful dismissal cases and terminations, human rights matters, and grievances in the collective bargaining process.
Good stuff. Thank you for that. And today's topic is the COVID-19 vaccines and in the workplace. So generally, do workplaces require COVID-19 vaccine policies?
So it's strongly recommended now, both by public health officials and basically by anyone else in the industry, that you should have a policy for your workplace that speaks to vaccinations. That can mean mandating a vaccine in certain sectors and subject to certain exceptions. But at the very least, there should be some kind of policy in place that sets out what the expectations are, given the working world in the pandemic.
So can you just tell us a little bit, or the listeners a little bit about, like you're saying the word policy, in the workplace. What does that effectively mean? Like, what is that?
Right. So what that means is your employer, your boss, and their human resources department should be developing some kind of internal document that is setting out what the expectations are for you as an employee or for your employees if you're an employer. And that's probably going to mean setting out who these rules are going to apply to in the workplace, and ultimately what these rules are and what the consequences are for not following them, as well as how to follow them, such as, for example, somebody seeking an exemption from it on human rights grounds.
And these policies are something that would be available for review by the employees and part of like a handbook? That's where these would appear?
Typically, that's how it's done, yes. Sophisticated employers with a thorough employee handbook that already exists are probably going to find themselves putting this in as one more policy, perhaps at the back of the book. And as far as review, typically they are available for employees to review. Typically, employees are also either trained on them or asked to read and sign off on them. So if you're bringing in a policy now relating to vaccinations, likely you're getting your employees together, going over it with them, distributing it to them in some form, and likely having them sign off on it.
And is there a legal requirement as an employer to give notice to your employees of this new policy you've slipped into the handbook?
It's very hard in a wrongful dismissal context, or really in any enforceability context, to try to say that an employee ought to be terminated or disciplined for violating a standard they're not aware of. So that's why you typically have sign-offs with employee handbooks and individual policies that are implemented later. If you're starting a job, you're typically a big book is put in front of you and you're asked to read through and sign that you read and understand it. Likely you might have a session where you're kind of walked through or taught some of these things. And that's the kind of expectation you would have going into a new job.
Now, let's say you have these policies, you do the sessions, and someone reviews these, an existing employee, yet they refuse to be vaccinated. What are sort of the employer's obligations there, responsibilities to that employee, one, and then to the rest of the employees or the patrons of whatever business that may be?
That's going to depend on what the policy is. So some employers and some sectors in particular are going to have policies that say you have to be vaccinated unless you meet a certain exemption under a human rights code.
What are those exemptions?
Typically, in the context of vaccinations, those exemptions are medical, some form of disability, or a religious or creed exemption that means a person can't receive a vaccine.
Now, religious or creed exemption, does that mean if I simply do not believe in a vaccine or vaccinations, is that in and of itself enough as a creed or a strongly held belief?
So that's a very good question.
Thank you.
The Human Rights Commission has given some commentary on this already, and one of the things they've said is that a singular belief against vaccinations is not likely to be a creed or a religious exemption that's protected by the code. A creed is defined by case law and to some degree by these policy documents that the Commission puts out. And basically, without getting too deep into the number of different factors that find themselves in the test, a creed is a holistic view of the world and your place in it, and a certain pattern of belief that you follow. That might mean a particular religious denomination, or it might mean something a little bit more nuanced than that. But it's not a singular belief against something like a vaccination. Similarly, an employee who just has a singular belief against wearing masks is also unlikely to find protection under the Human Rights Code.
So that comes in a bit into the duty to accommodate then.
Correct. So an employee with a bona fide human rights exemption triggers a duty to accommodate on an employer. Where that exemption exists, the employer has to find a way to accommodate them up to the point of undue hardship. A good example of that might be an employee who has an allergy to a component of the vaccine. So if you're allergic to the vaccine and you can't take the vaccine, it would be adverse treatment to find them not in compliance with a policy that requires them to be vaccinated. They simply can't be vaccinated. So that's going to engage the employer's accommodation process.
So who makes the decision then, right? You know, you're faced with a situation where you have an employee, you know, presenting themselves to you saying, I have a strongly held belief that I'm not to take any vaccine. And that, of course, applies. Now we're talking about COVID vaccines today, but that could apply to any other immunization. Who makes that decision, right? Like, is that initially made by the employer vis-a-vis the employee? And then if there's a dispute, where does that go? Like, what?
Yeah, it must be a tough call, yeah.
Right? Like, what? I don't know. I mean, it feels like that would be a really difficult thing. You know, you've got an HR department who's a HR professional making that decision.
Yeah, that's pretty tough.
Or does that go to upper management? Like, what happens?
Yeah.
Depends on the structure of the company, but also a good question, right? So usually the policy will speak to who it is you're supposed to speak with if you believe you qualify for an exemption. So if you have we'll use the same example, if you have a medical condition where an allergy where you can't get the vaccine, likely the policy is going to tell you need to go see the director of human resources or you need to go see your direct manager. And that's going to kind of start the process. For an exemption like that, the employee is likely going to need some kind of medical note from their physician or from some kind of specialist potentially, setting out why it is they can't be vaccinated. And normally that also requires them to indicate if there's a time frame that they can't be vaccinated in. An allergy, it's probably an indefinite time frame. And that, again, will take you into the step-by-step process of getting an accommodation plan arranged. So HR or management will review that, determine if there's any follow-up that needs to be done, and ultimately, if a qualified exemption is found to exist, then an accommodation plan will be developed for that employee.
So this really puts a strain, from what I would see, on the employee-employer relationship. And you're making the employee, right, go through a lot of work to prove this allergy. And what happens, and I know I don't want to get too far into hypotheticals here, but there are probably situations where the employee is having difficulty proving that medical exemption, or proving that allergy, or having some challenge in showing the employer that they should qualify for this exemption. And does the duty to accommodate go so far as paying this person to work while they're sorting this out?
It can, but it depends on the circumstances, right? So I'll give you another hypothetical. We'll use the same allergy example, which is probably one of the most clear-cut ways to find an exemption.
I would say so. I think that's probably what most people are facing, is because there are components we know of the vaccine that people are going to be allergic to. So
right. So if an employer is implementing that policy, and for example, it gives them a certain date to be vaccinated, or to show their proof of vaccination status, or to show proof of an exemption. You have an employee that comes forward making a request for accommodation based on this allergy. Perhaps that employee has been working from home thus far, but this policy is part of a process where the employer is bringing their workforce back. One way that might make sense to handle that issue is on an interim basis to keep that employee working from home while they arrange an accommodation plan or determine if an accommodation plan is necessary.
That makes sense to me. Yeah. Because, we look at these situations from both lenses, right? Of course, you're practicing in the management side of things, and, we're wanting to get down to what can help employees and what can employees take away from this, because that's ultimately the majority of the workforce is employees, and then
Absolutely.
you have management who is overseeing these things. But I think that for our listeners' sake, it's helpful to know what their options would be in that circumstance, because I think there are probably a lot of people right now that are looking for accommodations, medical exemptions, or at least some sort of way to prove that they don't necessarily need to have the vaccine.
Right. And not only through an exemption, but just simply a strong belief that I don't want to be vaccinated. So that's my next question is, someone just, let's say they don't qualify for an exemption, they simply do not want to be vaccinated. What does an employer do at that point? What options does an employer have? And what can an employee actually reasonably anticipate in that case?
So that, I think, goes back to some degree to my earliest comment on this topic area, which is that a singular belief against vaccination is not a protected exemption
but I say
request.
I'm not getting, as an employee, I'm not getting vaccinated.
Correct.
What does the employer do where there's a policy that says, because like the policy can it just be vaccinated or not? Like if you're not vaccinated, you're not working here.
Most policies aren't that strict. So
Right.
most policies, and it depends on the sector the employer is in, will present a few different options. So one of them is, by such and such a date, an employee should demonstrate that they're vaccinated, they're fully vaccinated against COVID, and they continue to work in the normal course. If an employee is unable to demonstrate that for reasons other than a code-protected exemption, then that usually defaults them into an additional option. That option might be a testing process. So, for example, perhaps on a weekly basis, they're going to get tested and ensure they're COVID-free because they're coming into the workplace. That's a common alternative we're seeing in a lot of policies that employers are developing.
And I have I think that this is probably relevant to everyone that's going to watch this or listen to us. Restaurants. Restaurants, to me, is a big,
Weird.
a big bubble of a problem, because when I walk into a restaurant now, I got to show my phone, right? You show your phone, show your ID. But now what you're telling me, at least from what I gather you're telling me, is that these workplaces, restaurants, could have a policy that says not mandatory vaccination, but some sort of vaccination policy. So my question to you then is, what kind of dichotomy does that create when you have workplaces that aren't requiring mandatory vaccination for their employees, but you're requiring the public to show proof of vaccination to enter that establishment?
Right.
What do you do there?
It's an interesting dichotomy, and you're right to flag it. So the vaccine passport system that the government has implemented for sectors such as the restaurant industry is distinct from the recommendation to have a vaccination policy in your workplace. I assume that when the government implemented the vaccine passport system, they did it in a way as to avoid, to some degree, mandating vaccinations in workplaces and keeping that employer-employee relationship a private one between the employer and the employee. But you're right, what that does create, at least in some sectors and in some workplaces, is the reality where you have patrons entering a restaurant that are fully vaccinated and need to be fully vaccinated to sit at the table, being served by a server who may not be.
And that's a problem, right?
It's a strange situation.
I don't like it.
As a customer, I am required to be fully vaccinated, while like you said, the person who is assisting me, whether it be in a restaurant or anything, where you're required to be fully vaccinated, the person assisting you does not have to have that requirement. It does create almost like a class of system there. I don't. That's a poor example, a poor choice of words, but it's an interesting issue.
And when I say I don't like it because of what it does. I think what it's doing is it's creating this divide between society, right? I think that's what we're noticing, and that's what this whole thing is causing. And what more so, I would expect it to be something like not employer, employee, patron. It should be to walk in that building. If that is a designated establishment by the government, that proof of vaccination is required in that establishment. To walk in the building, whether you're an employee or a patron, you should have to show proof of vaccination. And I think that that's where I have some problem with the way that it's set up, because, if I'm forced to show my proof of vaccination and there is a separate employee-employer relationship privately going on in the background, it's uncomfortable to know that it's not just uniform.
So there's case law going as far as up to the Supreme Court of Canada that comments on the employment relationship and basically says that there's an inherent dignity and sense of self-worth and value that a person typically ties to their employment. I can only assume, without being in the shoes of the premier's office and cabinet, that implementing vaccine passport system to try to limit the spread by people participating in the economy was an attempt to allow the economy to move forward without getting into that employee-employment relationship and potentially jeopardizing, at least temporarily, the employment of many employees.
It's a great point.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense to me. And it's hard sometimes to just, you look at these and you have these thoughts and you don't know, but that does make sense to me. I mean, I think that if you're looking at it strictly from opening the economy and getting the gears and the machine moving again.
Because let's be frank, there was a good period of time where the economy shut down,
mm-hmm.
and we're still feeling the ill effects of that. So that's a great point, that this is it could be seen as an economy position as opposed to simply like an equitable remedy.
And I think that's a good segue into our next topic and our next episode, which is going to be, the real life applications of these COVID policies in the workplace. Because I think what we can do is we're going to explore at least what, I think we've gotten into it a little bit, right? What that looks like. And now I'm excited to talk about next episode, what the real world implications and what's actually happening out there is going to look like. So with that, we'll take a break and we'll hear from our sponsor.
This episode of Off the Cuff is brought to you by Weaver Simmons LLP, Northern Ontario's largest full-service law firm with over 30 lawyers and 60 support staff. For over 90 years, the law firm of Weaver Simmons has proudly served the interests of Northern Ontario residents and has built its reputation based on exceptional services to its clients. For more information about the firm, please visit www.weaversimmons.com. The link is provided in the description below.
Welcome back. Matt?
Yes, Darren.
Well, we talk about this a lot, and we hear about this a lot in our personal lives, of course. But I'm curious now to find out what the legal implications are of this, because they've got to be.
Zach, surely
starting.
they've had to have been challenged.
So we're starting to see that already. Yes, the quickest way for those kind of things to find themselves into decisions typically are in private arbitrations. So in the unionized workplace settings, we're starting to see arbitrators make decisions on the reasonableness of these policies and the enforceability of vaccine mandates that are, you must be vaccinated unless you have a human rights exemption, as opposed to, say, a vaccine or testing policy.
And are these arbitrated decisions, of course I know nothing about what you do, are they followed by other, do they have to be followed by other employers, or do they influence the decisions of other employers in different sectors, or are arbitrator decisions, private, union workplaces isolated to that and those aren't shared with the public?
To some degree they're isolated, but the decisions are disseminated in the public sphere, and they will, I suspect, inform later decisions, possibly in non-unionized sectors.
And is it binding, like, judicial precedent? Like, does an arbitrator who is faced with a similar situation have to follow another fellow arbitrator's decision?
Not necessarily, no. And the other thing to remember is when it comes down to arbitrations over policies, every policy is a little bit different. And so it will be probably pretty easy in a lot of cases to distinguish one set of facts from the other. Keep in mind, too, this is the pandemic and things change by the day.
Yeah, I was going to say this is changing daily.
Well, and this might be a dumb question, but...
Probably, yeah.
Yeah, well, I want to ask it because the health units put out template policies. Have those been challenged by anybody?
I haven't seen that yet. But the health unit, at least the local health unit's policies, are not a you must be vaccinated or else, if I can put it that way. The health unit's vaccine template policy is more vaccination or testing and some kind of course on the benefits of vaccination.
And we can presumably assume that those templates have been vetted somehow?
I would think.
Okay.
We don't work for them. We don't know.
All right. I don't know. I'm asking the question. He knows, or should know.
Yeah, he should know, Zach.
Yeah, sure. Look, I don't know who develops policies for the health unit, but I think it's a good starting point for employers. I think it's a good template, and it's usually the first place I refer my clients as a starting point to see what's out there, and then we can work to tinker with a policy that's more specific to them and their needs.
Well, I'm excited to hear more about it. I think we're going to have a discussion about some of these arbitration decisions on our next episode. And I want to thank Zach for giving us some information on the policies, at least getting the discussion started. And we hope to see you guys next week. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening, guys.
Thank you.
Make sure to like, follow, and subscribe to our podcast.
Listen, do what you got to do to keep us around, okay?